I was still reminiscing about the joy of the past when I arrived at my house and noticed it was dark, and my parents didn't seem to be back yet. I pushed open the door and entered the house, and a cold atmosphere immediately enveloped me. I put down my school bag and went to the kitchen to get something to eat. At that moment, I suddenly heard a song, a long, eerie melody that seemed to come from far, far away, yet also sounded as if it were right next to my ear. I froze, listening carefully as the song became clearer and clearer, as though someone was singing softly nearby. A chill ran down my spine. How could there be singing at this time of night? I looked around, only to see the house was empty, not a single shadow in sight. I took a deep breath and walked toward the source of the song. Following the sound to the courtyard, I saw what appeared to be a figure standing in the corner under the moonlight. I was so frightened that I almost screamed. But when I looked closely, I realized it was just a coat hanger with some clothes draped over it. I breathed a sigh of relief. False alarm. I turned to go back inside, but suddenly the singing started again, this time sounding clearer and closer. I looked out into the yard once more and noticed something swaying in the tree next to the coat hanger. I rubbed my eyes and looked closer, only to see a blurry figure looming between the branches. Terrified, I wondered if there really was a ghost. I turned and ran back into the house, slamming the door behind me and leaning against it, gasping for breath. That night I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. The eerie song echoed in my ears, making it impossible to rest. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind blowing through the leaves, but no matter what, I couldn't shake the fear. The next morning, with dark circles under my eyes, I went to the village elders and asked if they knew about the strange events at the reservoir. The old men listened to my description with horror-stricken faces. They told me there were indeed some unclean things around the reservoir, and that people often heard strange voices and songs. After hearing this, I felt even more uneasy and decided I would never dare to play near the reservoir again. Ever since I heard that strange singing, my fear of the reservoir has only grown. Whenever I passed by, I would quicken my steps, afraid of being haunted by something malevolent. Despite my caution, something did happen. It was a sunny weekend, and some friends and I had agreed to go to the mountains to pick wild fruits. We set out happily, laughing and joking along the way, completely forgetting about the reservoir. As we passed by the water, I suddenly noticed something floating. I looked closer and saw it was a figure. A shudder of fear ran through me and I called out to my friends. They too saw the figure and their faces turned white. We looked at each other, fear evident in our eyes. "Is that James?" One of my playmates, Stephen, asked in a trembling voice. James was one of our usual playmates, lively and active, often playing with us. But since the last strange incident at the reservoir, he had stopped joining us. We all knew in our hearts that the figure was probably James, but we couldn't believe our eyes and didn't dare imagine how he could have ended up there. We hesitated for a moment, but finally decided to check it out. We cautiously walked to the edge of the reservoir and saw James lying motionless on the water's surface. Scared out of our wits, we ran home to tell the adults. They were shocked by our description and immediately organized a group to retrieve James's body. When we returned to the reservoir, James's body had already been pulled from the water. His face was pale, his eyes closed tightly as if he were still underwater. We looked at his lifeless body, filled with grief and fear. After that, there was no more laughter at the reservoir. Every time we passed by, we couldn't help but think of James and his pale face. We began to believe there was something unclean around the reservoir that had taken away our dearest friend. As time went on, other children in the village heard about James, and they started to avoid us, thinking we were cursed. We were isolated, forced to bear the pain and fear in silence. Even though we tried to forget the horror of the experience, the shadow of the reservoir lingered. Whenever it was quiet at night, that soft song would echo in my ears, reminding me of the past I wished to forget. One afternoon, I was walking alone in the village when I overheard some adults talking about the reservoir. They spoke in hushed, mysterious tones, as if sharing a dark secret. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to sneak closer to hear what they were saying. I followed them carefully into a wooded area, where they stopped and gathered to whisper. I crept closer and listened. One voice said, "There's a ghost buried in that reservoir, a spirit that preys on children." Another voice replied in a low tone, "Yeah, I've heard that too. That spirit was a tyrant in the village before it died, and it wasn't willing to rest in peace. What can we do? Mary's kids play by the reservoir every day. What if something happens to them?" a mother asked worriedly. "We can only tell the kids not to go there. It's really unclean," a father said helplessly. Listening to their conversation, I felt a chill of fear. So the reservoir really did hide a terrible secret. Trembling, I turned and quietly left. When I got home, I couldn't calm myself. The secret of the reservoir terrified me, but it also made me curious. I began to inquire about the rumors surrounding the pond, hoping to learn more. But whenever I brought it up, the adults became evasive and didn't want to talk about it. They seemed to deliberately avoid the topic, fearing it would bring trouble. I wasn't willing to give up, so I decided to go to the reservoir myself to see if I could find any clues to solve the mystery. The next day, I woke up early, slipped out of the house before the adults were awake, and followed the path to the reservoir. The water was calm as a mirror, as if nothing had happened. I looked around trying to find some clues. Suddenly, my eyes were drawn to a stone tablet. It stood in a corner of the reservoir with some faint words carved on it. I walked closer to read the inscription, which said, "This is the grave of the former tyrant, now turned into a reservoir to pacify their souls." I was shocked. So the reservoir was indeed built over the grave of a tyrant. As I continued to walk forward, I suddenly heard a strange sound coming from a nearby cave. Curiosity got the better of me, and I wanted to investigate, but the cave was dark and I couldn't see anything. The strange sound became clearer, as if something inside was screaming. Afraid, I turned to leave, but my curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. Summoning all my courage, I entered the cave. It was pitch black inside, so I felt my way around. Suddenly, something grabbed at my feet. I screamed in terror and struggled to break free. Finally, I managed to escape and ran out of the cave as fast as I could. Back home, I couldn't stop trembling. I knew that something unclean was in that reservoir, something I couldn't fight against. My fear reached its peak after that terrifying glimpse in the cave. The place that once brought me joy had become a nightmare. Whenever the night was quiet, I thought of that dark cave and the strange sounds emanating from within, and the fear kept me awake. It turns out that long ago, the site of the reservoir was the burial ground of a tyrant who had oppressed the people. Even in death, he found no peace, his spirit roaming the cemetery in search of a body to alleviate his suffering. The villagers decided to build a reservoir over the cemetery to suppress the spirit, but the construction didn't work. Instead, the spirit seemed to grow even stronger. It often appeared at the reservoir, luring innocent villagers and children into the cave, never to return. Hearing these legends sent shivers down my spine. I began to realize that the mystery of the reservoir was far more complex and terrifying than I had imagined. I decided to investigate the mystery myself and uncover the truth. So on a dark and windy night, I mustered up the courage to return to the reservoir. I walked around, carefully observing the surroundings. The trees around the reservoir looked gloomy, as if they held a dark secret. I followed the path to the cave, its entrance covered by weeds and vines, making it look even more mysterious and frightening. I took a deep breath and entered. The cave was dark, and I turned on my flashlight. I walked cautiously, afraid to step on anything that might trigger a trap. Suddenly, I heard a strange sound coming from the depths of the cave. The sound was deep and terrifying, like something roaring. I trembled with fear, but my curiosity drove me forward. I followed the sound into a narrow passage, which led to a wide chamber. In the middle of the chamber was a stone monument with more faint inscriptions. As I approached, I saw the words, "The grave of the tyrant, the water soothes his soul. Do not disturb, or you will be punished."